WisconsinEye is in Milwaukee at the State Democratic Party Convention, interviewing Attorney General Josh Kaul. Josh, thanks for stopping in. Busy around here, but
yes, thanks for having me.
Appreciate your time. Last week, you released the report 2018 on the crime lab. The focus on eliminating the rape kit backlog did delay acting on some DNA test kits. So how big is the backlog in the DNA test kits?
There's been an increase in the average turnaround time for DNA tests for the last several years. From 2014 to 2017, for example, there was an increase. And one of the things that's affected the turnaround times is the testing that was done for the sexual assault kit initiative. Yes. I think it's really important that we did that work, and I'm glad that the kits in cases involving where there hasn't been a conviction have now all been tested. And where there were DNA matches, we have reviewed, or we're going to continue reviewing those matches and pursue those cases where it's appropriate. But we also need to make sure that turnaround times for DNA testing are decreasing. And that's actually one of the main focuses of our budget request, is working to make sure we have the resources in our crime labs so that we don't have these delays. Because when a DNA test is delayed, that can slow down identifying a suspect, it can slow down a court proceeding, or it can prevent somebody who's not guilty of a crime from being exonerated.
The DNA caseload, then, did that actually increase in calendar 2018?
There has been a change over time, and with the work that the labs were doing with respect to sexual assault kits, there was also an increase related to that. But the biggest issue is we actually think we have a sufficient number of DNA analysts to do the work, but those analysts are spending too much of their time doing work that can be done by others. So what we've requested in our budget is additional forensic technicians who can do things like preparing evidence to be tested, or preparing reports from those cases, so that the analysts can focus their time on the analysis. Another thing we've asked for is pay progression, so that we don't spend money training analysts who then go off and work in the private sector. We want to make sure we're encouraging those analysts to stay in our state crime labs.
Joint finance is not yet acted on your budget. Are those your top two priorities, or is there something else that's more important that you hope they fund?
So our budget request overall is really a public safety budget. It's focused on modernizing our approach to fighting crimes and using modern technologies to fight modern crimes. I would say that the two things that are the biggest priorities for us are making sure that our crime labs are sufficiently funded and making sure that the Division of Criminal Investigation is sufficiently funded. DCI assists law enforcement across the state. They work on major investigations. They investigate officer-involved deaths, for example, and they help on a number of other types of cases as well. It's a critical law enforcement function for Wisconsin, and it's important that they be funded. But our other requests are really important too. We've asked for additional resources for our digital forensic unit, which recovers evidence from cell phones or from computers, and that evidence can be critical in lots of different types of cases, and it's evidence that can't be recovered by most law enforcement agencies because very few agencies have a digital forensic examiner. That's a service that we can provide to law enforcement around the state. That and other things that we've included are all ones that I think are going to make our communities safer.
Governor Evers' budget has not fared very well in joint finance. Do you think your budget will fare better?
I think it remains to be seen. We have reached out to talk to legislators. I'm hopeful that there's going to be support for what we've requested. And frankly, what we have requested is really, as I said, something that I think we should be able to bring people together on. It's about making communities safer and stronger. Crime labs serve communities across the state. The Division of Criminal Investigation assists law enforcement across the state. This is a critical function, and it's something where I'm hopeful that legislators of both parties will be able to get behind our request and will provide the funding we've requested.
Yesterday, your office announced resolution of the lawsuit Machinists District 10 versus Allen. Then Speaker Voss put out a press release, and these are his words, not mine, calling you a political puppet for the far left. What was at issue in that case, and how was it resolved, and how are you satisfied with the way it was resolved?
So that case was a challenge to an aspect of the right to work law.
The dues checkoff?
Exactly. So under that law had a provision that allowed people who had authorized dues checkoff to withdraw their authorization and to have the checkoff stop no later than 30 days after that. The problem with that is that federal law requires that period be a year, and the U.S. Supreme Court actually has a decision finding that 1 year federal provision preempts state law. So that case was tried in district court in Wisconsin under my predecessor. The court invalidated the law. It was then appealed to the Seventh Circuit. The Seventh Circuit voted 2-1 that the law was not permissible under the Supremacy Clause. The en banc Seventh Circuit didn't take it up. And then my predecessor petitioned for the Supreme Court to review that case.
Yes.
Now what's interesting is the law that was passed says essentially that it shouldn't be interpreted in a way that's inconsistent with federal law. So I looked at that and I said, look, we can resolve this case consistent with that statutory language because it says it's not to be interpreted to be inconsistent with federal law by saying we're going to leave federal law alone. We're not going to try to overturn this long-standing federal precedent that supports workers' rights. Instead, we're going to try to resolve this case. So we did it in a way that says if that Supreme Court case is overturned, the injunction will stop being in effect. So if federal law changes, then Wisconsin law will change. But we also were able to resolve that case, so we didn't have to spend a lot of resources litigating in the Supreme Court if it had granted review, and we got the opposing party to settle without any payment of costs. So to me, this is a win for taxpayers, and it's a win for working families.
You want to respond to Voss's comment, a puppet of the far left?
I don't think that comment deserves response.
Okay, let's move on. How is it that there can be a lawsuit filed, I think in federal court, over Act 10 8 years after Act 10 became law? I mean, is a new fact set arose, or give us a summary of that case.
As I understand it, the argument that's being made in that case is that in light of the Supreme Court's decision in the recent Janus case, that based on that ruling, there's a new argument that Act 10 is unconstitutional. And we're going to respond to that case the way we do with any challenge to a state law, which is that, generally speaking, we defend state law if there's a legally defensible basis for state law. And I anticipate that this will be an example where we do that. But as the review, as we make a decision, we're going to make a court filing and proceed appropriately with the case.
So DOJ is going to defend Act 10.
I think it's likely that will be what happens, given that our general approach is to defend state laws if there's a reasonably defensible basis.
You recently announced a lawsuit against Purdue Pharma with other states. Won't that take years to resolve itself? Is it going to be akin to the tobacco lawsuits of 20 years ago?
So the short answer is we don't know yet how long it's going to take to resolve. But what I can say is this. So 5 states filed suit against Purdue Pharma on the same day. 4 of those 5 states named at least one member of the Sackler family as well. We named Richard Sackler, and he's a member of the family that owns Purdue Pharma. He was also president of Purdue Pharma. And Wisconsin has a separate suit from the suits that were filed in the other cases. The states each filed in their respective states. So it's going to depend on how fast the litigation unfolds here in Wisconsin. What I can say is that there's a multi-district litigation that involves counties and cities and I believe one state. And that case has proceeded fairly slowly, but that involves lots and lots of different parties. This one is just the state of Wisconsin and the defendants who I mentioned. So my hope is that it moves more quickly. But the other thing is, whenever this suit got filed, it was going to take a period of time to resolve it after the filing. So that the length it might take, to me, is not a reason to delay filing. And what we've alleged is that Purdue engaged in deceptive marketing practices that sought to downplay the risks that opioids provide and suggest that the benefits were more significant than they were, all with the goal of changing the culture around the prescription of OxyContin and other opioids. And if you look at the data from the mid-90s to now, opioid prescriptions have gone up dramatically. I'm hopeful that one of the things that's going to come from this suit is that there's going to be a bit of a change in the culture when it comes to opioid prescription, so we can continue working to address this epidemic.
Didn't Purdue Pharma settle with the state of Oklahoma?
They did settle with the state of Oklahoma, and that's an example of a case that was moving more quickly.
Yes.
So they were near trial.
Oklahoma is in court right now against Johnson & Johnson.
Yes.
Is Johnson & Johnson under investigation by DOJ for the same allegations?
So my predecessor, Attorney General Schimmel, announced that Wisconsin was part of a multi-state investigation.
Investigation, not lawsuit. Excuse me.
That's right. Investigation into manufacturers of opioids. We've announced since I took office that we've also joined a multi-state investigation into distributors of opioids. Those investigations are ongoing, and ultimately we don't know how they'll resolve. There's certainly a chance that there will be settlements in these cases, but if we believe that it's appropriate to file a suit and that it's the appropriate time, we're going to do that as well, because my goals are basically twofold. One is I want to maximize the recovery that we can obtain for the state of Wisconsin based on unfair and deceptive practices, because we need funds to treat Wisconsinites who are addicted to opioids. We need funds to prevent people from becoming addicted and to educate them. And we need funds to work on enforcement efforts so that when heroin and fentanyl and other drugs are distributed, we are able to hold people accountable. So that's number one. And number two is I want to make sure that there is a public accounting of what led to this epidemic so that we both have a better understanding of how to address it and that we can hopefully prevent another epidemic in the future.
If Purdue Pharma settled with Oklahoma and they came to Wisconsin with a settlement offer, you'd be willing to consider it then?
With any of these companies we're investigating, we would consider the settlement in this case the same way that we would in any other case, which is that if we thought that resolving the case was in the best interest of the state, that's what we would do. But it would depend on the terms of any potential settlement.
The number of opioid prescriptions has fallen in Wisconsin. Do you think it's significant? Do you think that's a very good sign in the war of addiction?
I do think it's a good sign. In the last few years, the prescription rates have dropped. I think that is a really important step in the right direction, because as those prescription rates drop, I think we're also going to see rates of substance use disorder dropping. That's going to be part of what we need to do to address this epidemic. But we also need to remember that just because somebody isn't prescribed an opioid, that doesn't mean that they're not going to then, because of their addiction, attempt to get opioids another way. And so I'm really worried about people who are prescribed opioids then moving to fentanyl or moving to heroin. So we need to make sure that we are both decreasing prescriptions, but also working to make sure that there's something in place for people who are addicted already so that they don't end up left without any lawful treatment means. That's one of the reasons I think it's critical that we expand access to substance abuse treatment.
You travel the state talking to law officers. What about the methamphetamine problem? Is it still growing in northern Wisconsin?
I believe it is, yes. The data indicated it was growing pretty significantly, and that potentially in 2017 it might have gotten a bit better. But I think that is a growing problem and one that we need to really keep our eye on. I think we talk a lot about the opioid epidemic, which is absolutely appropriate. But I think it's important that we also talk about the growing methamphetamine use. And it's, it is a problem, particularly in the northern and western part of the states, but it is expanding. And I think people are going to see it in a lot of parts of the state. And, it's critical that we understand that fighting meth addiction is important just as fighting opioid addiction is.
And are local law officers saying they're seeing more and more fentanyl in Wisconsin?
There has been more fentanyl in Wisconsin. The submissions to the crime labs of fentanyl have increased. And what's really concerning about fentanyl is that it's extremely potent, more potent than heroin. It's yet another reason that people need to make sure to stay away from illegal controlled substances, because it is so incredibly dangerous. I'm hopeful that message is coming across, but it's a message that we need to keep working to get out. Both fentanyl, meth, and opioids, people need to avoid.
Do you agree with Republicans who took out of the governor's budget medical marijuana provision?
So what I would like to see is Wisconsin adopt medical marijuana. So what I would like to see is for us to do that, see how it goes, and assess, because there are a lot of things that we want to analyze. Is it having an impact on the safety of our roads, for example, and how do we go about making sure that only people who should have prescriptions are getting them. But at the same time, I think that the use of opioids could go down if we prescribe medical marijuana, because I think there are cases where that could be a substitute. I also think there are people who are facing chronic pain who would benefit from medical marijuana use, and I think it would be a source of real revenue for the state, and hopefully we could use that revenue to fight things like the opioid epidemic. So to me, I think it's time to move forward with medical marijuana.
Okay, just two more questions. Talk to me about DOJ's reversal in the high-capacity well case. What led DOJ to reverse its position?
We sent in a filing in that case, and just to give a bit of backstory on that, as you know, my predecessor issued a AG's opinion that indicated that DNR was not permitted to consider the impacts that high-capacity wells had on surrounding groundwater.
It was not permitted to.
That's right. And that decision was then blocked by a circuit court. That was then appealed, and now the Supreme Court is going to take up that appeal. In the filing that we submitted to the Supreme Court, in that case, we indicated that the DNR no longer believes that its position is consistent with controlling law. And I'll note that in 2011, the state Supreme Court decided an issue that relates to how the public trust doctrine applies in a very similar factual context, the Lake Beulah case, and it unanimously found that DNR did have authority pursuant to the public trust doctrine. So we'll see what happens with this case, but the filing we submitted is what's reflective of the reason the position changed.
And then the last question. During your campaign, you called for a law that would allow judges to take guns away from someone who was a threat to themselves or others. The governor didn't include that in his budget. Do we still need that law in Wisconsin?
I think what we need is a red flag law, yes. The way that I think that law should be written is to indicate that the family member or a police officer of somebody who is an immediate threat, an imminent threat to themselves or others, that if that's the case, that the family member or the law enforcement officer can go to a judge, provide evidence of that, and if the judge finds the evidence convincing, the judge could issue an order that allowed that person to be disarmed temporarily. They could then later go back to the judge and ask for reconsideration of that. But I think that there are cases where people are suicidal, and making sure that they don't have firearms could help save lives. And I think in cases where people have made threats, threatening to commit some sort of tragedy, that law enforcement has a tool that allows them to disarm that person.
Attorney General Josh Kaul, thanks for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.